Welcome to Lair, the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. For today's episode, I have a very special guest with me, Christopher P. Hilton, the author of the awesome new book, The Spectacular Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal. So thank you for being on the show today, Christopher.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. It's an honor.
Yeah, and this book just came out about a month ago, right?
Yeah, a little longer than that. Yep, brand new.
Yeah, brand new. I just did a review on it on my channel a couple days ago. So if you haven't seen my review, after you're done watching this video, go back and watch the review. I'll summarize it for you. I loved the book. So if you're a fan of this music, you're going to absolutely love this. It's super thick. He covers everything from the rise, the dramatic fall, and then the rebirth rise again. So, all right, Christopher, tell us, how and when did you get into heavy metal?
Well, first of all, thank you for your kind words about the book. Much appreciated. It means a lot. I'm really glad you liked it. My beginnings with hair metal are probably curious in nature, an inauspicious start perhaps. Back when I was born in 1974, late 1974. So when I was about 9, 10 years old, I was actually a fan of, pop music, whatever was on the radio at the time, probably bands like Huey Lewis or Billy Idol, Loverboy, Bryan Adams, I'll admit it, even Cyndi Lauper, right? So these are the things you heard. I think it was 85 or maybe a year after it was released, 1986, a friend of mine had a tape of Motley Crue's Theater of Pain. Right? And so he brought that over, and it was really the first time I had heard something like that. I said, could you have something here? You may have something. So that was interesting, but really it wasn't until just after Appetite for Destruction was released in 1987. I was on the junior high school bus, and I don't have many memories from a kid, but I'll never forget the first time I heard that. The bus driver would always let the cool kids, submit their tapes for play on the ride to school. And I was not one of the cool kids, for sure. But I heard the beginning to Welcome to the Jungle. And I was like, wow, this is different. And you listen to the guitar riff and that atmospheric beginning and Axl's, vicious kind of vocals. And I thought, wow, this is real. This is edgy. And that was it. I mean, I was hooked from that point forward. I went back and rediscovered all the things I had been, not completely into since 1980. And it was all hair metal, hard rock, heavy metal from that point forward. Just couldn't get enough of it. And here we are 30 years later. It's still a huge part of my life every day, and kind of culminating in the book.
Awesome. So what inspired you then to take that step to write a book on this, on hair metal?
Hair metal fans, or hard rock and heavy metal fans, if there's one thing we like doing more than listening to that kind of music, it's talking about it, right? And sharing our opinions about it, and what we like, what we don't like. We love lists. You generally don't see a whole lot of this with other genres. You don't see, people sitting around discussing generally what are the top 10 rap albums of a certain year, but you see a million of them for hard rock and heavy metal. And so, I'm just another super fan who wants to talk about it and share his opinions. For better or worse, hair metal might be the only thing I'm even remotely qualified to be considered an expert on. So I figured, why not me? And the other thing is, I think I've read just about everything there is to read about hard rock from the 80s. And there's tons of articles and great insights and amazing books and biographies. You can read books about Guns N' Roses, or Sebastian Bach's book, or Steven Tyler's book, or Slash's book. And they're all terrific, but I thought what was missing was something that really tied the whole story together, right? I mean, hair metal's story is really a movie-like arc, right? It had this huge, tremendous rise to fame and like a rocket ship, and then it had this ridiculous crash and fall from glory. I don't know any other music genre that had something like that. Maybe disco, I guess, but nothing that was just completely wiped off the face of the earth, seemingly. And then, kind of rose back to prominence after the new millennium. Here we are, 30, 40 years after some of this music was released, and it didn't happen, but Motley Crue, Def Leppard, and Poison, as you know, we're going to play stadium tours this summer, yeah. Right? And these are bands that, would have struggled to sell out my backyard in 1997. I mean, I kid, but you get the point. I just thought there was never a book that talked about the genre itself, all the individual bands. And so I thought there was a story there. Really, I think it's the book I always wanted somebody else to write so I could read it. So, but
Yeah,
why
no.
not me, right?
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. I agree with you. There are a lot of books just about the individual bands, like, Motley Crue has their Heroin Diaries, and other artists have written books and stuff, but one just sort of about the whole genre. And you are right, it is kind of like everybody loves underdog stories, right? So, and everybody loves watching celebrities crash and burn, but then come back to life. So that's kind of what the hair metal story is, really. It's, they were at the top of the mountain, the highest peaks and the lowest lows. And then they're able to, live through all that and come back again. So I also like the fact that right at the beginning of the book, you address this term hair metal, because I had to, my channel is only at this point, whatever the date today is, August 15th or whatever, is only 2 months old. But one of the first videos I did was my 5 favorite hair metal bands. And even at the beginning of the video, I kind of, hair metal, I don't know. I know we could call it LA metal. We could call it, I'm just going to call it hair metal. And I didn't get into it in the video. And in the back of my mind, I was like, I've got to make a video addressing this subject of the term hair metal, because it's a really loaded term. And there's some people that hate the expression. There's some people that sort of embrace it and put it on their flag and wave it. So I'm glad that right at the beginning of the book, you address this. And I agree with you. I agree with your assessment on this term hair metal. So just talk about that. Talk about the word hair metal, how you came to just decide, all right, this is what I'm going to use for the book. This is how I'm going to proceed forward.
Certainly. I mean, and how many discussions and wars have been launched about the term hair metal, right? It is a polarizing term, unlike many others. As you are aware, the very first sentence of the very first chapter says, "I got a confession to make. I hate the term hair metal," right? And don't get me wrong, I love the music, but I hate the term. And what some people might not know, I mean, depending on how old they are or when they got into the genre, or if they're into the genre, the term hair metal wasn't even invented until long after the genre's heyday, which was generally considered to be 86 to 91, the peak years of this music. Up until that point, everything was mostly heavy metal, and it's almost impossible for us to believe that in retrospect. But in 1988, bands like Poison and Def Leppard were heavy metal. That was the word. Or maybe towards the very late 80s, people used glam rock. But hair metal wasn't invented until long after the era was popular. It was really in the early to mid 90s, after grunge took over, and people needed a more pejorative, disparaging term to label this music for. And hair metal was implying that the genre wasn't credible or about music, and it was really substance over style, in effect. And bands hated this, right? And they still hate this to this day. I mean, just the other day on Twitter, you saw Sebastian Bach kind of losing his mind over someone using the term. And I get it. I'm with them. I mean, anyone who would insinuate that the genre was not credible in terms of music that had substance and legitimacy, I think is doing it a disservice. That's not to say, fashion wasn't a big part of it too. But here's the thing, at the end of the day, so many years later, you need a way to characterize it. And like it or not, I mean, the term hair metal has really become a universal identifier for this kind of music. I really cringed when I thought of using it for the book's title. But what would you call it? You could say, okay, it's the rise and fall of glam metal. But at that point, people say glam metal. Well, maybe it's about David Bowie or Alice Cooper or the New York Dolls. And I'm not sure glam metal is too much better than hair metal anyway, right? Glamour, fashion, hair are not too different. Or you say, okay, I'll call it 80s rock. That could have been in a lot of different bands that aren't
Billy Idol, or
right, ZZ Top, Billy Idol.
Right.
Okay, so the bands would say, well, it's just rock and roll. Well, that could have been anything. Or you call it heavy metal. Well, that's generally reserved for the thrasher bands, Metallica or Testament or Megadeth. So if you want to be clear to your audience, we can love it, we can hate it, but you say the word hair metal and people know exactly what you're going to get, right? You're going to get Guns N' Roses, Skid Row, Warrant, Poison, Whitesnake, Bon Jovi, etc. Rat. So I think just clarity of subject is important. And I also think that the term, yeah, it's a disparaging term and some people still use it that way, but I think it's kind of evolved to more of a nostalgic type of term, right?
Yeah.
People use it fondly these days. And I've talked to many fans who won't touch the book with a 10-foot pole because I dared to label their band hair metal, right? And I think that's a shame, but I get it too, right? If anyone wants to tell me that the genre was all about, the style and size of people's hair versus the music, I'm going to get my tail a little fluffy. But at the end of the day, I think it's just a universal identifier. So, like it or not, there it was on the cover.
Yeah.
And I beg forgiveness, for all our heroes that take objection to it.
No, I understand, because like I said, I go through the same thing when I was making that video, and I'm planning on making other videos. And my thoughts on it are, well, usually the first thing people say is, it just comes up frequently, is to call it glam metal. And my problem with that is glam for me is a more specific thing. Okay, glam metal are metal bands that were influenced by 70s glam rock. So 70s glam rock for me is T-Rex, David Bowie, Slade, and especially the band Sweet, the album Desolation Boulevard, right? So 80s bands that I would say fall into that template would maybe be Hanoi Rocks, Faster Pussycat, Poison. I don't know, off the top of my head, those are the only ones that I can think of. So bands like Dawkins and Rat, and I would even say the first Motley Crue album is a glam metal album. Because if you listen to the first Motley Crue album, there's a lot of very, I don't want to say bubblegummy, but like melodic,
like Starry Eyes, right?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of some of the songs. Come on and dance, like that kind of thing. And there is some heavier stuff on it, like Live Wire, but there's a lot of, merry-go-round and round, which fits with me with more of like a T-Rex, Sweet kind of vibe. Whereas when Motley went to Shout at the Devil, that went more towards the Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, hard rock side of the spectrum. So for me, the word glam doesn't cover all those bands. It doesn't cover early Rat. It doesn't cover early Dawkins. So that's why I don't like the term glam. I don't think it applies to all those bands. And I get, like, I'm a little bit older than you, so I was there right when the first Rat album came out, the first Motley album came out, the first Dawkins album came out. And in my mind, there really wasn't that much of a difference between what they were doing and what Judas Priest was doing in 1983. Judas Priest had songs like Living After Midnight and stuff like that. And to me, that was, okay, these bands are taking the more melodic side. They're not singing about demons and wizards and that kind of stuff. And they're singing more about partying and girls and stuff like that. But it still had that heavy riffing, the chugging guitars and stuff like that. But I do agree that or even Quiet Riot, like the first Quiet Riot album, to me sounds more, I got it right back there, sounds more influenced by 70s than it does, because Kevin Dubrow was really into bands like Humble Pie and Small Faces and stuff like that. So that's what I hear on like Quiet Riot and some of the early Rat, the early Dawkins. But as time went on, it definitely did go. By the time you get to like Bon Jovi, I understand that, okay, now there's a pretty big difference between what Bon Jovi's doing and what Iron Maiden and Judas Priest are doing. It has moved into way more of a radio, melodic, AOR sound. So I don't know, do you just call it melodic heavy metal? And again, it gets sort of messy. And like you said, for better or for worse, this term has stuck. And you're right, in the 80s, no one was calling it hair metal. It wasn't until the late 80s, the 90s, when grunge came around. But then you also had all these, you think of all these radio shows like Dee Snider's House of Hair, and when VH1 started doing the behind the music things and everything, it just became, for better or worse, the term that was used. And as time goes on, I have another video that I haven't released yet, just about genre names. As time goes on, you have all these other offshoots. You have thrash metal, death metal, black metal, all these other things coming around. In 1983, there weren't all these different things. It was just like heavy metal. And so that's why it sort of got lumped in there. But when all these different bands and styles started shooting up, you had to sort of give a little bit of a different name for things so people understood that. When somebody says, why don't you just call it all heavy metal? Well, because there's a really big difference between Cannibal Corpse and Bon Jovi. So when somebody says, I'm into heavy metal, it's almost like, well, what do you mean by that? That could mean so many different things. So for better or worse, the tag is out there. I think that in a lot of ways, some bands and some artists and some fans have taken this now, and even though it may have been a put down, it has now become something that they've embraced, and it's like, hey, okay, I'm into hair metal and I'm proud of it. I don't care what anybody says, you know. So I agree, it's a sticky thing. I'm glad right at the beginning of the book you address that and sort of get the elephant in the room out of the way and say, look, just to keep it simple, I'm going to be saying hair metal. And hopefully it doesn't upset people, and I get it. There are some people that it still upsets, but I think at this point it's something that it's just stuck. And so embrace it, be proud of it. Don't be ashamed of it, I guess.
It's always guaranteed to spark quite a conversation, isn't it?
Yeah. So I love the way, and for those out there that haven't read the book or saw my review of it, what Christopher does is each chapter is a year by year breakdown of what's happening. And I like the way at the end of every chapter, you kind of highlight these sort of essential albums from those years. And I found it especially interesting when we got to the 90s, because I'm a little bit older than you. So I was there for that first, what I call the first wave of hair: Rat, Quiet Riot, Dokken, Motley. But by 88, 89, I had pretty much gotten off that boat. I had abandoned ship, pulled the lever, eject. I was out. So
you weren't alone.
I really didn't write. A lot of people write my age. I find it interesting because you discovered it a little bit later. So you embraced that little bit of late 80s stuff way more than I did. And it really wasn't a case of like, that I didn't like it so much as I was burnt out on it by then. And some of the stuff that was coming out in the late 80s, it was just way too radio for me, way too formula for me. But what I liked is in the 90s section, you know, you don't gloss over the 90s, and you talk about what all these bands were doing in those down years. And it helped me go back and discover some albums that I just never listened to, never paid attention to. One example is Extreme, three sides to every story. I went back and listened to that, and I was like, wow, this is like really, really good. Same thing with Warrant's Dog Eat Dog. So there were a lot of good albums that came out in like 91, 92, right before the grunge bomb dropped.
Yeah.
That just, because of their timing, really got ignored.
Sure, absolutely. And you know, it's a misconception by the average fan that, you know, hair metal somehow didn't die after 1992. You know, it really didn't. It kind of went underground, but a lot of the artists were still making music. Now, again, a lot of them evolved to different styles of music. But, you know, somewhere around late 1991, early 1992, with the rise of grunge, I mean, for bands that played the style of music, you know, it was game over. As simple as that. You know, a style of music that was so incredibly successful and so predominant on radio and MTV just a couple years or a couple months earlier just went immediately out of fashion.
It was vaporized.
Yeah. I mean, if you were anything associated with that type of music, you know, you were instantly obsolete, outdated, and a laughingstock to most people. You know, and there's this famous saying, you know, you've heard it too, grunge killed hair metal, or more specifically, Nirvana killed hair metal, you'll hear. And I think there's some truth to that. There is, but it's not the whole truth. You said it best. You know, a lot of these bands, and the music was becoming saturated and copycats and kind of, ripping itself off. And that's not to say some of these musicians that came out in the very late 80s weren't talented, because they were, and I'm huge fans of them. But bands like Firehouse, or Trickster, Steelheart, or Tora, Sweet FA, Kick Tracy, you name it, they weren't exactly reinventing the wheel, and there was only so much supply and demand. The music itself had started to change. You listen to some of those albums from 1990, Poison's always going to be Poison. But on the Flesh and Blood album, there were actual steps towards maturity, if you could use that word loosely. Even Warrant with the Cherry Pie album, now Cherry Pie notwithstanding, tried to take a step in a more serious direction with songs like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Cinderella put out Heartbreak Station, which was nothing like the heavy metal glam nature of Night Songs in '86. And even in 1991, Skid Row's Slave to the Grind. That wasn't anything to do with hair metal or glam metal, or even the Use Your Illusion album. So the music was changing itself, but I think grunge was just kind of in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
It was a new generation, and every genre runs its course, right? We don't know one that hasn't run its course. Rock music was always about rebellion, and there was no rebellion for kids in liking something that was already a commercial king. And I think the music was more accessible to kids of that generation, right? It was easier to play 3 chords. The spectacle of these huge Motley Crue concerts and stage shows, was something they might appreciate, but they couldn't relate to it, right? I mean, grunge was more relatable to kids. You had people that looked like you, that acted like you, and you could say, hey, that's something I can imagine. And the times were different, right? I mean, as the 80s came to a close, times were grimmer and more somber. And, there was a different political and socioeconomic climate than what was present during hair metal's birth and ascension, which was just all about the 80s and excess, right? This was a different time.
Right.
Kids didn't want to have nothing but a good time anymore. They wanted to embrace that anxiety and alienation and angst and depression, and grunge just felt more real to them. You couldn't find those things in hair metal. Kids could relate to that stuff in grunge. And the music industry, right? The siloed and inherent behavioral approach of the music industry just served to exacerbate this. A band that sold 3 million copies of their album last year, from a record label standpoint, well, great. We're dropping you, and you'll be lucky to sell 300 copies this year. And that's just it. Overnight just completely turned their back on these bands. And I think hair metal in itself, you can make the argument that maybe it wasn't built to last. At some point, you can't play guitar any faster, you can't party any harder, right? It has to burn itself out. So I think all those things contributed. But yeah, once you got to 1993, there wasn't a whole lot of success if you were a hair metal band, quote unquote.
Yeah. A couple thoughts on that. So I have a thought, and let's see if you agree with me, that if some of these bands had shifted their sound to a more, let's say, mature sound, like you said, in the late 80s rather than like 91, 92, if Warrant had released Dog Eat Dog a little earlier, if the album Cherry Pie wasn't called Cherry Pie, if Extreme had released 3 Sides to Every Story a year or 2 earlier, maybe it would have pushed the whole genre towards that more, in a more serious direction, a different direction. And it would have saved it. I don't think it would have completely saved it, but maybe some of those bands would have survived a little bit better. I think a lot of it is the timing. Those albums came out in 91, 92, and it was already kind of too late. If they had just shifted a little bit earlier, because it's all about timing.
Yep.
You look at Metallica's Black album. You look at the few bands that were heavy metal that had careers that accelerated in the 90s, that were already acts from the 80s. I'm not talking about new bands that came onto the scene. Okay, so like Metallica. Metallica released the Black album in, I don't remember if it was 90 or 91. Metallica changes their sound a little bit, and they managed to sneak that in right before grunge happens. And Metallica was very successful through the 90s. Ozzy Osbourne is another artist. He releases No More Tears in like 91. He changes his image. He gets a little bit more mature, sophisticated, drops some of the bats and castles and type devil type stuff that he did on the older stuff. Not that I love all that older stuff, but he was able to switch his image a little bit before, with enough time before the grunge bomb dropped, that they were able to survive through the 90s. And I think for a lot of these bands, it was too late. They had, even though they were trying to change, it was just too late. And if the change had happened maybe a little earlier, they would have been able to ride that through some of the 90s. But by 91, 92, it was pretty much just over. If you hadn't made that shift already and established yourself as moving in a new, more mature direction, you were stuck.
I think there's a lot of merit to that, right? It is all about timing, and maybe they could have helped push the genre in a different direction. I think there's merit to that, but at the same time, I think maybe it would have been destined to fail, right? And outside of timing, you look at what a lot of these bands did in 92, 93, 94, 95. They did change their sound. And take an album like you mentioned, Dog Eat Dog, right? This was not the Down Boys, and this was not Cherry Pie. This had some serious stuff on it. It had the Bitter Pill, right, which used a symphony, and songs like Andy Warhol Was Right, or really heavy rockers like Machine Gun. This was not the hair metal on their first two albums. But the people who grew to love those bands in general, I think, loved those bands because of the type of music they played, right? And if they were going to play a different type of music, I'm not sure that it would have resonated with a lot of fans the same way. Take Motley Crue's 1994 album. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I assume you are. Of course you are. I love that album. I really do. But it wasn't what people had grown to know Motley Crue for, right? And they did push it in a different direction. Yeah, at that point it was too late. But even if they had come out with the self-titled album, in 1989, I'm not sure fans of Motley Crue, that's what they were looking for. In 1993, Poison put out Native Tongue, right? And I'm sure you're familiar with this album. Didn't have CeCe DeVille. Had a very, very bluesy type of organic, type of authentic sound. This was not Talk Dirty to Me in any way, shape, or form. The lead single, Stand, came out and immediately featured, a chorus with gospel singers. And so I was, dying for the new Poison album in 1993. And, I heard the single. I was like, well, I appreciate what they're trying to do here, but this isn't why I love Poison. Right. So I think, some of it could have got ahead of the trend and maybe helped bring fans along the journey, because a lot of these bands did evolve to things that I think were just as good, if sometimes not even better than what they had done in the 80s. But I think the average fan, 8 out of 10 fans, liked them for what they were. And they probably wouldn't have hopped along the train, unfortunately. And it is a shame, because you take an album, like you said, Three Sides of Every Story by Extreme. This was an epic endeavor that was clearly a lot of thought had been put into this, and tremendous musicianship, as opposed to, fans that on their first album, they wanted to lap up a song like, Mother Don't Want to Go to School Today, right? Which you could probably play in your sleep, as opposed to something from, Three Sides to Every Story, which is very intricate. But the fans didn't come on board. They were interested in what they had loved in the first place. So I think it's hit or miss. But what really surprised me is these bands that, like Motley Crue in 1994, I think that's where they were evolving to, regardless of trends. Now, I could be wrong about that. But when Warrant, put out Ultraphobic in 1994, or Belly to Belly in 1996, and other bands, even with Native Tongue, or when, take a guy like David Lee Roth, who put out Your Filthy Little Mouth in 1994, these bands were trying to change and trying to adapt to the trends. And I never really understood it. Even in hindsight, you would have thought at the time, if you were, let's say Warrant did put out the greatest grunge sounding album ever in 1995, grunge fans weren't going to give it a chance because it had the name Warrant on. And the few fans that Warrant had left, they probably didn't like grunge, right? So, they weren't serving any master at the time. And I don't know how they ever thought that it could be successful. Maybe, their managers convinced them it would be, I'm not sure. But these style changes generally didn't work out for the bands.
No, and that was going to be one of my next points, that I don't think anybody was able to change to the, grunge style and make that work for the reasons you just described. you alienate your old fans. The new fans of grunge music, the younger kids aren't going to embrace it because it's dated and it's something from the 80s. And I can sort of understand these artists because to go back a little bit when we were talking about when grunge hit and how it was like a bomb dropping, sometimes we'll talk to younger kids who weren't around then. And I say, I'm speaking for the United States because I know in Europe it was different, but here in the US, it was really like, it wasn't like it just sort of slowly went out of style. It was like it was vaporized, and it felt like it was erased from everyone's computer banks or their memories, like space aliens erased it from. It was like something that people wouldn't even talk about, wouldn't even mention it. It was like you'd be walking around somewhere and you'd run into somebody, hey, I know you, aren't you that guy that's really into Poison and Rat and no, that's not me. I don't know you. It was the punchline to jokes. It was, these bands were just flat out obliterated off the map. And it was really, if you were a fan of that kind of music, it was really depressing because it felt like it literally happened overnight.
It was August 27th, 1991, right? That was the day Smells Like Teen Spirit came out.
Right.
And honestly, it really wasn't overnight, right? As much as people like to think it is in revisionist history. It wasn't more so than anything else that ever happened. But I remember in 1991, I saw Van Halen and the opening act was Alice in Chains, right? And there was nothing, strange about that. It was all rock and roll. Now, of course, that would change within the year.
Well, that's a good point because when I first heard grunge, my initial reaction to it was, I loved it because I was like, wow, this, and here's what went through my mind when I heard Soundgarden, I thought this is Black Sabbath. This is early 70s Black Sabbath, down-tuned guitars, heavy chugging riffs. I'm talking like Bad Motorfinger, like their early albums. When I heard Pearl Jam, I thought, wow, this is like 70s rock. When I heard Alice in Chains, I thought it was like Black Sabbath. And I distinctly remember, I have a vision in my mind. I can picture myself in this record store flipping through a magazine when Soundgarden, like their EP or their first album came out, and reading an interview with them, and they were talking about Black Sabbath, like their influence. They were saying heavy metal. Right. And then something happened like a year or two into it where it became this anti-metal thing, where grunge became anti-metal. And it was
the grunge bands, they didn't like that term. Remember, Soundgarden hates that term.
Yeah. Well, you're right. They sort of view the grunge term the same way the hair metal bands view hair metal. But these bands, this is where I just did a review of King Buzzo. He's Buzz Osborne from the Melvins, who was an early Seattle grunge band that influenced all these bands. And it made me go back and listen to the Melvins. And I was like, man, this is heavy riffing. This is heavy metal. This is doom metal. And so a lot of those early bands, they had long hair. Yep. Yeah, they weren't teased out hair, but they were kind of, it made me think like, oh, this is like 70s metal. These guys, long hair and beards and ripped jeans and down-tuned guitars and heavy riffs. And then all of a sudden somewhere it became like, whoa, you can't say heavy metal anymore. Like all of a sudden nobody was influenced by heavy metal. It was like, it became like a 4-letter word or something. And it was a very strange, like the press or the media pushed this narrative. And it was so strange because to me, it felt like, okay, this feels like a natural evolution here. We're going back to our roots. Whereas we had all this radio melodic stuff in the late 80s, early 90s. And now we're getting back to the dirty roots of heavy metal, Black Sabbath and all that kind of stuff. But somewhere the press, the media, the narrative got flipped where heavy metal became like this 4-letter word.
Well, that's the thing, right? It was mostly the industry that wouldn't let the two exist at the same time. Even myself, when I mentioned Alice in Chains, I bought their first album, and when I heard the opening chords for We Die Young, I thought, hey, this is great, right? I didn't know the two couldn't come to coexist together. I might have felt differently. but yeah, I mean, it was over for bands of that type. There's this great story, true story. Warrant cut a demo for a new song in the mid '90s, and they thought it was a great song, and they didn't have a record deal at the time, and so their manager submitted it to the record label, and he strategically scratched their name off the tape, so no artist. And the head of the record company picked it up and he listened to it. He said, "Wow, this is fantastic." Right? Who are these guys? We got to get these guys in the studio. We got to get them marketed. They're going to be the biggest thing. Love this song. And the manager said, "Okay, just want to let you know this is Warren." And he's like, "The cherry pie guy? I don't want anything to do with this. Nope, throw it out." Nope. Yeah. And that's what it was. You just couldn't win for winning.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I heard a similar story with Tom Kiefer and Cinderella, where he had some solo music, and the A&R guy played it for all these young people at the record label. "This is fantastic. What is this?" "It's Tom Kiefer, the guy from Cinderella." And everybody quietly walked out of the room. And I feel bad for certain bands like Cinderella, and Tesla are another one to come to mind, where Tesla, all right, Cinderella on their first album, they had the look, the glammed out look and everything, but they pretty quickly moved away from that into a more blues rock, Stonesy, 70s type of sound. Yeah. And Tesla, in my opinion, was never a hair metal band. They never dressed like that.
They never looked like that.
They never looked like it. And bands like them, I say, they unfortunately got called hair metal by proxy because of their location or their timing. I mean, Tesla wasn't even from the LA scene, but they got lumped into that.
Sacramento, right?
Yeah, they're right. So they just got lumped into. Wasp is another band. I mean, they dressed sort of like that, but they were more just like, they didn't sing about the same things that everybody else was. But because they came up through that LA scene, they just get lumped into that. And I feel bad for bands like that maybe if their band name was different, maybe if they had done it differently at that time in the 80s to distance themselves a little bit more. But in the 80s,
the trend, right?
Exactly. In the 80s, this stuff was so popular that, of course, everybody wanted to be, you wanted to be associated with this because it was getting played on MTV like crazy. It was.
Or you didn't, right? I mean, from reading the book, I'm a big fan of the power pop band Enough's Enough. Right. And these guys were not heavy metalers, at least, Donnie V. But when it came time to do their first video shoot, I'm sure you've seen it, for New Thing, right? All of a sudden, the record label had them decked out in, as much hairspray as their heads could hold. And there's all the big neon colors and everything. And they're kind of like, isn't really us. But that was what was popular. The thing was, particularly as you moved on to the mid 80s, MTV came along, right? Or certainly MTV was there in the early 80s. But if you wanted to be successful as a hard rock musician in the 80s, MTV was the primary mechanism for exposure. And if you wanted to be on MTV, you had to look pretty, right? You had to have this look that fit with the times. So countless bands, probably wound up looking like that and being advertised like that really never would have been. Tesla's a great example, or even Extreme, right? I mean, Tesla's, we're getting back to genres and classifications, but Tesla's a 70s classic rock band at their heart. Yeah. Nothing more, nothing less. So some of these bands are probably horrified that they're associated with that. But, hey, like you said, it is what it is, and it was what it was.
Right. So why do you think then that some bands like Motley Crue, Def Leppard, Bon Jovi, how were they able to survive the 90s? I understand how somebody like Ozzy could, or Metallica, because even though they may have, like Ozzy, maybe briefly flirted with hair metal, he was around before it. So he was never really, he didn't come up through that whole time frame. He had a career before it. So it was easy for him to step into it for a little bit and then step out. Metallica was a thrash metal band. But how did somebody like Motley Crue, Def Leppard, Bon Jovi, they survived the 90s a lot better than, some of these other bands like Trickster and all those bands. How do you think that they survived and got through the 90s and came out on the other end, still intact?
I know, right? I think it's a couple things. Specifically, there were some bands that people might say are hair bands, like Van Halen or Aerosmith,
Yeah.
that technically survived the 90s, right? And people will make the argument that these weren't 80s hair bands to begin with, right? And they certainly weren't. I mean, the 70s, Aerosmith was a 70s rock band. Van Halen was a late 70s rock band. So they had more quote unquote credibility in some people's eyes, the average fan. Bands like AC/DC had more credibility. But to your point, when you think about Motley Crue and Def Leppard, you know, and this sounds critical, and I don't mean it because I love these bands to death. They survived probably on the basis of nostalgia, right? I mean, when you look at what Motley Crue did in the 90s, I mean, I loved the 1994 album. Most everybody else did not. I don't think anybody loved Generation Swine in 1997, right? I mean, God bless them. You know, you hate to say music can be objective because it can't, it's all subjective. But if there was anything that was objectively not so great, it was Generation Swine.
Yeah.
Wasn't great material, but yet once we got to the new millennium, people developed a nostalgia for the 80s and wanted to revisit some of the good times and glory of their youth. And Motley Crue was there to play their songs in concert to these people that wanted to hear them. You know, they put out New Tattoo. Not such a great album, right? I mean, they tried to get back to their roots, and terrific. Love them for that. But, you know, it was a pale comparison to stuff like Shout at the Devil. Def Leppard put out Slang in 1996, which some people will say is a grungy alternative album. I happen to love it, but I also know it has nothing to do with the Def Leppard you heard on Hysteria, or at least the sounds aren't the same. But come 2000, you know, they also embraced this nostalgia for that style and that sound of music. They put out Euphoria, which basically sounded a lot like Adrenalize, you know, and they had the big hit single Promises, which to your point was very melodic, AOR-oriented, commercial-friendly rock song. Now, Bon Jovi, I think, has something extra going on, right? Not only were they playing to the nostalgia of their hits, but they did change and took some people along with them, right? I mean, Bon Jovi, their last 4 or 5 albums, as we look past the past 20 years, these are successful albums. I mean, as successful as an album can be nowadays, people don't buy albums anymore. But those albums have nothing to do with the Bon Jovi from the late 80s, right? This is country music perhaps, or AOR, or, you know, Bruce Springsteen-ish music, or people like to say soccer mom music. Excuse me, don't mean to offend anybody. But, you know, Bon Jovi brought some fans with them to a different place. And in 2000, when they did the Crush album, which was very different than the very somber These Days record they did in 1995, they had the big single, right? They had It's My Life, which was, I think, the 3rd biggest single in the world that year,
huge
right?
song.
And so Bon Jovi was suddenly influenced to a whole bunch of people who had never heard of Bon Jovi, perhaps, or didn't know, you know, that they were famous for, you know, songs like Bad Medicine. So some of the bands came back on the basis of the strength of their catalog and nostalgia, and some bands actually did take the fans to a different place. And that's really where the rebirth was felt. It was on the touring circuit, right? In 1999 and 2000, there were tons of reunions. There were these package tours. Bands started to learn if they went out in a package and people suddenly, you know, grunge was basically gone, and people could come and see 4 or 5 bands. And for a night, you know, these people that weren't in their early 20s anymore, you know, they had jobs, they had families, they had real life. They could, you know, go to a place on Friday night and see 4 or 5 bands and kind of relive their youth, right? So you had the Rocks Never Stops tour. You had Poison getting together with Cinderella. Rat got a new record label. Cinderella got a new record label. Quiet Riot was touring. Slaughter, Firehouse. And, you know, there was this rebirth where the sound was there again. Like I said, Euphoria and New Tattoo and Crush. Poison got back together with CeCe DeVille. Tons of reunions, and bands were able to, you know, make a livelihood out there. You know, they weren't playing arenas anymore. They were playing clubs, but, you know, it was enough to sustain a lifestyle. And so that's really, you know, what kind of brought this thing back is the combination of nostalgia and bands getting back together and, you know, eking out a lifestyle for themselves doing this.
Yeah, and I think that by that point then, in the late 90s, early 2000s, they were embracing their past. Whereas in the mid 90s, you had all these bands trying to put out albums that sounded grungy or trying to fit in. None of them worked. Late 90s, VH1 Behind the Music, there's this sort of reinterest in the genre. And also, let's be honest, things tend to cycle. You know, they tend to go in like 10 to 15 year cycles. So the people who were 15 in 1985 were now 25 or 30 in the early 2000s. They're getting nostalgic. These bands embrace their pasts. they're going out on tours and are saying, hey, we get it. We're going to play all the hits. You know, we're not going to play anything. You know, we know what made us famous. They embrace their past. Whereas in the mid 90s, it felt like they were trying to run away from their past. A lot of
Could you blame them?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, going back to how it was here, at least in the States during the 90s, in like 95, 96, it just felt like, you know, grunge was never going to end. And that I can understand why these artists like, look, the only way for us to survive is we have to just throw this out there and see if we change, if maybe it'll stick, maybe we'll be able to get something to happen. And usually it didn't work for anybody, but
no, I remember some of those albums. I remember Vince Neil's Carved in Stone, you know, the rap rock album. You remember LA Guns did American Hardcore in 1996, which was basically Pantera, their version of Pantera.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story. I saw LA Guns on that tour, and I went because I didn't even know anything about that album. Saw that they were playing somewhere. It was like a Wednesday night, so I'm going to go. So it's mostly people my age there, meaning people at that time, it would have been people in their 30s. And they started playing, and there was a stampede for the door. I mean, by the third song of the set, there was maybe 100, 125, 150 people at the most inside the club. By the time they got to their third song, there was maybe 5 people left in the club. There was literally a waiting line. Wow. Waiting to get out of the club. They were just like, what is this? The singer was up there like kind of screaming, and their look was real grungy and everything. But I think Motley Crue was able to survive the 90s, not having anything to do with music, although I love the self-title album. I agree with you. I love that album. They kept their name in the tabloids, in the news, because of celebrity, Tommy Lee, and who he was dating, and Nikki Sixx, and I don't remember when the Heroin Diaries came out. Did that come out in the 90s?
Well, it was really The Dirt coming out in 2000.
Okay, right. The Dirt came out in 2000. Book. Right. They just kept themselves, whether it was just the tabloids, but they kept themselves sort of in their name in the public sphere. And I really think that then when there was the resurgence, they were able to come out on the other side and were able to withstand it. So I appreciate the fact in your book that you don't gloss over the 90s, you delve into it. It helped me discover a lot of albums that I missed. So I appreciate that the 90s are not just glossed over. All right. So, let's see, you mentioned earlier, we love lists, right? Okay, so give me your 5 favorite hair metal albums.
Oh gosh.
I'm putting you on the spot. I didn't tell you I was going to do this, I don't think, in our messages, because I want to get it off the top.
Let me, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to cheat if you let me. I'm going to give you my 5 favorite. But, you know, like you said, I mean, it depends, you know, when you cut your teeth on hair metal, right? I actually saw your list on your channel earlier this morning. I was looking at your channel, and of course, there are albums that are clumped around this 1983, 1984 timeframe. Right. Although I love that you had Long Cold Winter in there, Cinderella for those not indoctrinated. So of course, my list is naturally clustered around 1987 to 1991. But after I give you the 5, I'm going to give you another list, and I promise not to be overly verbose, although I always fail at that, of records I would consider more like essential to the genre, right? Maybe a more objective list. But anyway, personal, subjective top 5. And let's just say in no order here, because it'd be too hard. Generally, my favorite albums are ones that go top to bottom. You know, take an album like Girls, Girls, Girls. 2 of Motley Crue's best songs are on that album, Wild Side and the title track. But that album has a lot of filler, right? For me, an album as a best album's got to be good the whole way through, or at least, you know, only a couple of weak spots perhaps. Appetite for Destruction is going to be on my list. You already know that. You know, lightning in a bottle, I think they captured with that album. As they say, you know, all killer, no filler, that basically no weak spots, no songs you would skip. It was a turning point for the genre. You know, they didn't look like Poison. They didn't look like Bon Jovi looked like in 1986. And, you know, that turned it in a different direction. But just, between Axl's voice and Slash's guitar playing, or Adler's swing, as they tend to say, or Izzy Stradlin's ability to write rhythm guitar parts that perfectly complemented Slash's guitar. I don't know how he pulled that off. In the songs. I mean, these are classic songs for the genre, whether it be Jungle or Sweet Child of Mine or Paradise City or any of the album tracks, they call them, that I tend to like even more. Be Rocket Queen or Mr. Brownstone or Think About You. Okay, so that's going to be one. Poison's Open Up and Say Ah is going to be my list. Some people would argue that should be Look What the Cat Dragged In, but again, music is subjective. We go with the great David Lee Roth quote, music is like girlfriends. There's no accounting for people's taste, right? Gotta love Dave. But yeah, I mean, if you want to have a record that embodies hair metal, Open Up and Say Ah would be up there. It seems like there's just never a bad time for it. There's hardly any skippable songs. I mean, maybe some tracks are weaker, like Tearing Down the Walls, or Bad to Be Good. But, Nothing But a Good Time is basically the genre summarized in 4 minutes. Every Rose Has its Thorn, certainly one of the classic ballads from the genre. Fallen Angels, probably my favorite Poison song. And the album tracks, again, are songs like Back to the Rocking Horse or Good Love are probably just as strong as any of the singles. So always willing to give that a spin. I'm probably going to drive you crazy here because I'm going to list Motley Crue's Dr. Feelgood, which about a billion fans, if they're listening right now, are going to say that should be Shout at the Devil. And Chris, you're wrong. And I get it. I hear them. and on some days I may agree with them. So it might be sacrilegious, but Dr. Feelgood was really just Motley Crue at the apex of their commercial hype. Right.
Yeah.
And Shout at the Devil was mean and nasty and vicious and fantastic. And Dr. Feelgood, and you can consider this a good thing or a bad thing, but it was more polished. It had bigger, glossier production. It had more commercial type music. The musicianship was probably a step up for sure, because Bob Rock put them through their paces on that album, probably drove them insane. 5 singles. So for me, that was right when I was really, right in the thrust of getting into this genre. So it'll always be in there for me. Again, I promised I wouldn't be verbose, failing you. Bon Jovi's New Jersey is on my list. And again, people would say, how can that not be Slippery When Wet? Slippery When Wet had the classic songs. It had Living on a Prayer, which is probably, if not the single, maybe definitely top 5 most enduring songs for the whole era. It had Wanted Dead or Alive, You Go, No Bad Name, but there was also some, not filler, but not as strong tracks, Social Disease, others on that album. New Jersey was really designed to be everything Slippery was, but just bigger and better. Right from the opening chords of Lay Your Hands on Me, that big atmospheric intro that was designed for their stage set. New Jersey had, I think it was 5 top 10 singles. No rock album did that before. No rock album has done that ever since. Not to say albums should be, on your favorite list just because they had commercially successful singles. But I just like the fact that, top to bottom, it's a great journey. It has great album tracks like Stick to Your Guns. I mean, 2 of my 3 favorite songs of that record weren't even released as singles. Blood on Blood or Homebound Train, which was, Bon Jovi rocking as hard as they could at the time. And then I'll round it out with Skid Row, Slave to the Grind. Again, probably, a strange choice because that didn't sound like hair metal, at least not as some people defined it, or, it wasn't Rat Out of the Cellar or, Metal Health. But again, that was a blistering album, right? I mean, they went away from anything that was commercially melodic, and they had this, set of really crushing heavy metal songs almost. It had 3 ballads, but these weren't, Every Rose Has its Thorn. These weren't I Remember You, even from their debut. These were dark, powerful ballads. Sebastian Bach was at, the top of his game vocally, and it's a great listen. So there's my 5 favorites. Apologies to anyone I've offended with that.
Well, no, you make a good point that it has a lot to do with where you come into it. I came into heavy metal in 1980, so my bands were Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, Dio, Ozzy, Accept. So when the stuff that I gravitate towards with hair metal tends to be the slightly heavier, slightly darker stuff, like the early Rats, Shout at the Devil, that kind of stuff, So it's all where you come into things.
Yeah, I mean, they say like whatever music you listened to when you were 16, that's your favorite music for the rest of your life, right? And there's probably a lot of truth to that. But I will give you very briefly, for those who want a more objective list, I'll give you 5, and even this, people are going to disagree, which is great. 5 that I would consider more essential or representative to the genre, and a couple of these I think are on your list. So Slippery When Wet, is going to be there. I mean, that really just broke the doors down for the genre, right? We had Quiet Riot's album before that. We had Shout at the Devil. The Slippery When Wet really put hair metal into people's living rooms. Poison's Look What the Cat Dragged In, certainly essential.
Yeah.
Shout at the Devil for sure. Rat's Out of the Cellar. I mean, in 1984, hair metal was Rat was hair metal. From the look, the sound, the songs. You said earlier, I mean, hair metal was about taking heavy metal and adding this melodic type of pop sensibility to it, right? That's what you heard on Out of the Cellar. And then maybe a strange choice, my last one for most representative, I'm going to say, is Whitesnake's 1987 album.
Yeah.
I mean, in 1987, this album was hair metal, right? The band,
huge.
the look, the sound, the songs, the ballads, you know, the blues type influence to it that managed to still be there in little bits. So I had to cheat and give you two lists, but you had me on the show. Sorry.
All right. That's no problem. All right. Well, tell everybody out there, is there any place where can they get the book? Where can they go for more information about the book? Do you have a Facebook, a website, anything you want to share with the people out there?
Yeah, thanks. Very briefly. If they want to know a little more about the book, my website is www.hairmetalforever.com. So you can learn a little bit more there. You can find a link to buy it on Amazon. You can buy it directly from Amazon. Just search it under The Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal. You can find me on Facebook. I certainly love hearing from all the fans, and I've been really lucky to have a lot of people reach out to me and say that they enjoyed the book. And trust me, it means the world, because you know, you put so many hours, and probably about 1,400 hours into something. You hope that somebody appreciates it. So I'm glad, but I really appreciate the ability to speak with you about the book. I'm glad you liked it. I appreciate the support, and I look forward to future conversations.
Awesome. Well, I would like to thank Christopher for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. This was a great discussion. I highly encourage everybody to go out and get the book, The Spectacular Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal. I got mine off of Amazon, so I think it's very easy to get. It's out there all over, so I highly encourage people to check it out. So thank you for your time, Christopher. I'm hoping this was such a great conversation. Maybe there'll be some other 80s hair metal type topic that we'll tackle at some point in the future. We'll see. So thank you for your time, and for everybody else out there, leave a comment down below. Let us know if you've read the book. I posted something on like a glam metal site or something, and a bunch of people posted down below, oh yeah, I read it, it was great. So let me know if you've read it down below in the comments. Let us know what you think, some of your favorite hair metal bands, some of the topics that we talked about. And make sure you hit subscribe and like. And until we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.
Thanks, John.